So what is ISPU? For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, we are a research and education organization focused on the American Muslim community. Why do we need this kind of work? Why do we need research at all? There is a problem in our society whereby dialogue and decisions about American Muslims are often misinformed. Misinformation is not just about being misunderstood in society or confronting some negative interpersonal interactions in your daily life. Misinformation causes wars. It enables death. It enables surveillance. It is the reason that children are bullied in school. So misinformation is weaponized against vulnerable communities. The solution, part of the solution, and the beginning of any real change is truth-telling. It's telling the truth. You do that by doing the work, by doing the homework of rigorous research and then getting it in the right hands. And that's what ISPU exists to do, is rigorous research and putting it in the right hands so that decisions and dialogue about the Muslim community are based in facts, not fear or misinformation. So I'm going to be presenting research that we collected in our annual survey. We do every year, ISPU conducts an opinion survey among American Muslims, American Jews, Catholics, Protestants, non-affiliated Americans, as well as just the general public. For those of you who are interested in the methodology, I can talk to you more about it. You can also read about it on our website. But very quickly, this poll was conducted about a year ago in January of 2019. And it was given to a representative sample of the American public, as well as a representative sample of American Muslims and American Jews. These are some of our advisors. We've collected the best minds on American Muslim polling and have asked them to advise us on this poll. So this is really, it's a report and it's a study that you can cite, that is cited by even the Department of Justice. This is very reliable information, and if you need more information about that, please come talk to me afterwards. So what we did in this report is to create something called an Islamophobia index, whereby we are measuring the level of Islamophobia among the public year to year. And here are some of our key findings, and I want to get to the conversation with the panel as soon as possible, so I'm going to be brief when discussing the research. First, Islamophobia inched up from 2019 versus 2018. Just a little, but it did inch up. Some of the things that are protective factors against Islamophobia in society are knowing a Muslim, knowing about Islam, and positive views of other minority groups. And within the American context, Jews and Hispanic Americans are the most favorable toward Muslims, whereas as a group, white evangelicals are by far the most negative. So in constructing an Islamophobia index, now just very briefly, an index, like the NASDAQ index or any index, is a series of measures that you basically combine into an average to give you a reading on the level of any kind of phenomena. Now, what should we be measuring when it comes to Islamophobia? We could measure 100 different things, right? The way we did this, though, is we looked at the public perceptions that link to policies. Here's what I mean. Every single one of these questions, when people believe them, when people endorse these anti-Muslim stereotypes, other research has shown that endorsing these ideas is linked to support for anti-Muslim policies. And this is the important link between what the public believes about Muslims and the kinds of policies that the government is then able to put forth, and the public will accept them. So if anyone ever asks you, why does it matter if there's, public Islamophobia, the reason it really matters is because it manufactures consent for anti-Muslim discriminatory policies that impact your daily life. That's why it matters. So these are the 5 key points that when the public believes them, it makes it much easier for the government to carry out anti-Muslim policies. Here they are. Most Muslims living in the United States are more prone to violence than others. They discriminate against women. They are hostile to the United States. They are less civilized than other people. And they are partially responsible for the acts of violence carried out by other Muslims. So, just jumping to the conclusion, our Islamophobia index has a range of 0 to 100, where if the entire public said strongly agree to every single one of those, it would be 100, and if they said strongly disagree to all of them, it would be 0. So the number that we found from the general public, 2019, was 28 on that range. So it's not off the grid, but it's also, it's sort of in the amber zone, and it was 24 in 2018, so it is inching up. Now, this is the second key point I want you to walk away with. Islamophobia is bad for democracy and security. If you think Islamophobia is a problem for Muslims only, then you're wrong. Islamophobia is an issue for every single American who cares about freedom and safety. And here's why. Because a higher Islamophobia index is linked to greater acceptance of the military targeting civilians, just in general. Greater acceptance of individuals targeting civilians, otherwise known as terrorism. That's the definition, right? As well as state terrorism. So people who are more Islamophobic are actually more likely to themselves endorse terrorism. Greater acceptance of authoritarian attitudes. So people who are more Islamophobic are more comfortable with taking away democratic principles in our country. And finally, greater support for anti-Muslim policies. So yes, it impacts Muslims, but it impacts a lot of other things that impact every single person in the United States. This is a look at where each community lands on the Islamophobia index. Muslims are a 14. So does Islamophobia impact Muslims? Yes. We have a whole report on internalized Islamophobia. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, but it's a really important topic that we have to deal with. Jewish Americans come next at 18, and then the highest on the Islamophobia index are white evangelicals at a 35. This is just another look at those, basically the same conclusion. So another important consequence of rigorous research is you can respond to misinformation in the public discourse. The narrative that the right has been pushing, especially against people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, is that Muslims, by their very nature, are inherently anti-Semitic. And therefore, not because of anything else, they are critical of the state of Israel, right? So what you actually see in the data is that Muslims and Jews tend to be very similar in the way they see each other, okay? So favorable views of Muslims are favorable of Jews at 45%. Jews are favorable of Muslims at 53%. Those are very similar numbers. The percentage of unfavorable are also very similar. So Jews are among the most positive toward Muslims, and Muslims actually reciprocate that view. So it is not an inherent issue of animosity between these two groups just simply for existing as a religious community. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind when you're discussing issues of critique of a state. Now, interestingly, white evangelicals who often accuse Muslims of being intolerant, the most ironic thing I've ever heard, Muslims are actually way more positive toward white evangelicals than the reciprocal. Most Muslims have no opinion, are just neutral when it comes to evangelicals, and a third are positive, are actually favorable. The opposite, though, is not the case. When it comes to white evangelicals, the plurality, 44%, are negative toward Muslims. Interestingly, Jews are the most likely to know a Muslim, and it helps to explain their relatively positive views of Muslims versus white evangelicals, who are the least likely to know a Muslim. And knowing a Muslim has a huge impact on someone's Islamophobia index score. So if you don't know a Muslim at all, the average score is 35 in the Islamophobia index. Knowing a Muslim is you go to a 22, and then knowing a Muslim as a close friend, it's all the way to 18. Now, if you take all of this data and you do something called a linear regression, where you're basically seeing what predicts, or what is the protective factors of less Islamophobia. This is real numbers we can use to make programs and suggest policies and advocate for different things. What predicts lower Islamophobia? So these are strong predictors. Some of these things, there's nothing you can do to produce more of these people, but it's just something to know. Being a Democrat, okay, it is partisan. This is not, we're a nonpartisan organization. This is just what the data says. I can't help that that's the case, but being a Democrat is a predictor of lower Islamophobia among people in the United States. Favorable views of Black Americans is a predictor of lower Islamophobia, as is favorable views of Muslims. That's more intuitive, but as is favorable views of Jews. These 2 points are very important. Anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism are linked to Islamophobia. They are different branches on one tree of bigotry. Islamophobia is a form of white supremacy. That is what the data suggests. Favorable views of LGBTQ people is also a predictor of lower Islamophobia, and then knowing something about Islam. Now, I want you to notice something. Knowing something about Islam is an even more powerful predictor of lower Islamophobia than knowing a Muslim. And this is key because we think that by quote unquote humanizing Muslims, that's all we need to do, and never addressing issues around misconceptions about Islam as a faith. And that's not the case. We can't get around having to educate about what Islam actually teaches. Moderate predictors of lower Islamophobia, favorable views of feminists, knowing a Muslim, and having high income. And then weak predictors, although they are still, they're still significant, identifying as a liberal, unfavorable views of evangelicals. So these 2 things actually do tend to move in different directions, and then having a close friend as a Muslim. Now, what didn't matter? This is just as important. What actually made no difference whatsoever? Whether you're an immigrant or a native born doesn't matter. Immigrants are not more pro or anti-Muslim. If you're a woman, that doesn't matter. The idea that women tend to be more tolerant, not the case. And I can go on for a long time about that, but I won't. Age, my most surprising finding. Being young, all other factors being equal, does not predict lower Islamophobia. Level of education, shock, right? Being more educated in terms of number of years in school doesn't actually matter. It's about being educated about Islam specifically. That's a very strong predictor, but just simply having more years of school does not make a difference. And then religiosity. Being more religious in your own faith, being more devout as a Christian does not actually matter. Islamophobia is about a political ideology, not religiosity. And this is so key because we often respond to Islamophobia with interfaith dialogue as if it's a religious conflict, and it's not. It's actually about white supremacy and political ideology. So quickly, recommendations from the data, and then I'm excited to have the conversation with our panel. 4 key recommendations. Build coalitions with other impacted communities. Islamophobia is not an isolated phenomenon. It is connected to anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. 2, keep demystifying Islam. We can't not do that. We have to keep educating about the faith itself, not just, quote, humanizing Muslims. 3rd, do more than interfaith. We have to have our outreach along different kinds of lines, around intercultural lines rather than interfaith. Interfaith is actually, and I'll just be frank, it's usually a placeholder for suburban mosques to reach out to suburban churches and synagogues, and it's usually a very South Asian, Arab, white outreach process, right? We have to do more than that. That's great. It's great to talk to your neighbors and everything like that, but interfaith cannot be where we end the way we do outreach in our communities. And then make Muslim friends for anyone who doesn't have them. They're great to have, and that will protect you against Islamophobia. So thank you very much, and now I'm going to call up our panel.